Please join me in welcoming the history guys, Peter Onuf, Ed Ayers, Brian Balogh.
From the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, this is BackStory with the American History Guys.
Welcome to Presidents and the Press, a Pulitzer Centennial event.
And I think, as most of you know, we're here because we're celebrating the centennial of the Pulitzer Prize. And in thinking about how to get into this program today, we thought, well, how can we put together Pulitzer with a powerful president? And it was obvious how we should do this. We should say a few words about, in essence, a clash of the titans, a great battle between Pulitzer and Teddy Roosevelt. Now, for those of you who don't know Pulitzer, he was born in Hungary. He emigrated to the United States around the middle of the century, and he built a media empire starting from the ground up. And that's how things were done back in the 19th century and definitely the 18th century.
We had a lot more ground then.
You had a lot more ground, that's right, and a lot less of it was paved. Yeah. So he started with German newspapers, ethnic newspapers, and then he bought 2 St. Louis papers, combined them to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, but it was still a very local operation as things were in the 19th century. His big move was to buy and renovate the New York World, which became the largest mass circulation newspaper in the United States. Now, Teddy Roosevelt started locally as well. As police commissioner, he went after vice, he went after political corruption. He then went over and fought a glorious little war, the Spanish-American War, as a Rough Rider, made a name for himself, became governor of New York very briefly, and then the Republican Party chose him to run with McKinley as McKinley's vice president. When McKinley was assassinated in 1901, Teddy Roosevelt rose to the presidency. So each man was at the pinnacle of emerging institutions that were going to shape the 20th century. It was pretty inevitable that they were going to come to blows, given their outsized personalities and given the growth of these institutions, and that's exactly what happened. In 1908, after Roosevelt's hand-picked successor, Taft, ascended to the, won the election, Pulitzer and the World published an op-ed that charged that Roosevelt's brother-in-law and that Taft's brother had received money from the $40 million that went to build the Panama Canal, one of Roosevelt's central issues. It was a direct attack on Roosevelt, who himself had made a name for attacking corruption. Roosevelt wasn't going to take this lying down. Never mind.
He didn't take anything lying down.
No, he didn't, and that's why he carried a big stick. But Roosevelt, never mind that there was no federal law on libel, decided that the federal government was going to prosecute Pulitzer and the World for libel. Unanimously, the Supreme Court threw this out, said there is no basis for the federal government to prosecute for libel. Okay? Pulitzer actually thought he was going to go to jail for a while. That's how serious this was. Supreme Court throws it out. Now,
it's a good thing he didn't, or we wouldn't be sitting here.
Well, we wouldn't be speaking so freely at any rate. So, you know, you can attribute this to personalities, and that's a big part of the story, right? But I think just as important, and a good way to kick off our show, is talking about the radical change in the institutions that each man was involved in. Pulitzer now was sitting atop a truly national organ for speaking on behalf of the American people. And what did Teddy Roosevelt think was the basis of the modern presidency that he supposedly founded? Speaking for the American people.
So
Back in the beginning,
Well,
how
back in
was
the
it?
beginning, how did we get the struggle that Brian was describing? How did the press get to be so mighty, and how did the presidency get to be so mighty? And how did we have that great titanic clash that Brian described to us? Well, let's start. Everything begins in the founding. We have to start with me. It's a ritual on our program. And the press was not a distinguished and important or influential discipline or profession in the colonial period. In fact, they had dirty hands, they were artisans, they were workers, printers. There were no editors as such, and occasionally gentlemen would write something that the printers would print, but it's hard to imagine what fundamentally happened in the American Revolutionary people. The press made the revolution. They keep telling themselves that now. The press made the revolution without all the arguments that spread across the continent, tied American patriots together. It was through the press. It was a press-made revolution, a press-made country, because the press led the charge for the federal Constitution and the emergence of the modern presidency. This was a hard sell, because why would you want to create a strong central government after you had a revolution against a strong central government? So the press, the party, and the presidency. Let's just stop at that moment, a moment of silent contemplation. What a great way to re-begin American history.
This guy from Illinois, a one-term congressman, has some debates in a failed run for the United States Senate.
This is a quiz.
Yes, you can guess who it might be. It's not John Adams or George Washington. And people are electrified by the words that he reads. Now, fortunately, there's no photography that could be discriminated by the press, and so they just read his words and they think, this Abraham Lincoln guy might have a future in politics. So when this brand new Republican Party is trying to figure out who they're going to put forward for president, people know Abraham Lincoln through the press, through his words.
But the reason I think the story is a little more optimistic by the end of the 19th century, and I think one of the things that actually leads to the possibility of having a Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting, for independent reporting, is the rise of an independent press. Now, it's not all rosy. You've all heard about yellow journalism. And one of the ways that the press became more independent, separated itself from the political parties, was to generate a different source of revenue. Those contracts that Peter and Ed talked about, they were replaced by advertising revenue. And by the beginning of the 20th century, this guy Pulitzer, I mean, he had his friends, he had his enemies, but he was not the mere creature of a political party. He was independent force. What politicians did from this point on, starting with Roosevelt, was to figure out how to tap the press to create their own independent base.
So, Carol, as someone who actually creates this, I don't know what your feelings would be. Do you feel that the media is sort of losing its teeth? I mean, people say more things, but are people listening to it less, or you don't believe that?
I think we're against some significant obstacles, some of them financial in recent time, and for some organizations that's very perilous. I think against those obstacles we're doing just fine. It would be nice if we had more accessibility with our politicians, and they weren't constantly trying to find ways to communicate unfiltered without having questions asked of them. You think when someone signs up to be a public servant that they realize they have to answer those questions. But I think we're going to do just fine to have plenty of teeth.
I think that's the sort of thing that Joseph Pulitzer would want us to end with, so we'll stop with that.
That sounds terribly positive. Come on, Debbie.